Well, good morning everybody. Another Monday is here, and I was going to start out today telling you about this transmission fluid exchange business. I had done this on several vehicles. The president of the college bought his wife a E320 2004 that was a used one at the time even, and he was telling me it had a lifetime transmission fluid in it and all that, and it was a fairly high mileage car when he got it. After she'd been driving it about a year, it gave trouble with the transmission, and I told him to get the right kind of fluid for it and how many quarts to get. You know, I looked up how many it took. And, so you need more fluid than the total amount of the vehicle capacity for the transmission to do the transmission flush right. And there's a clean oil tank and a dirty oil tank. You fill the clean oil tank up with about 2 quarts more than the total capacity of the transmission. And you got to run the engine, and sometimes you got to hold the RPM up a little bit to have the transmission fluid pressure right, because you got to hook between the transmission cooler and the line going into it. And so the fluid that's coming out of the transmission is forced to go into the machine in the dirty oil tank, and the fluid that comes out of the clean oil tank goes back into the transmission and replaces the dirty fluid. And then what we always like to do is, whenever you could do that, you know, not all automatic transmission fluids have a pan and a filter that you can pull off and change easy. But after we did the full fluid exchange doing the machine, we would follow up and do a regular transmission fluid change and swap the filter out and all that kind of stuff. And replacing the fluid in this transmission on this Mercedes fixed the shifting problems. Saw a Cadillac crossover, and the transmission, it was giving shifting problems, and the transmission fluid on that one looked like brake fluid. It was so dark. I never seen that on one that wasn't burnt up. And it didn't smell bad. It was just a black color. And so I was wondering, is this a new kind of transmission fluid? But anyway, we did a fluid exchange on that one with the right kind of fluid, and that's important. You got to use the right kind of fluid, and we fixed that one too. And so I always like to, you know, it costs a little something to do this fluid exchange, but it's got a pretty good chance of fixing it. But you got to make sure you explain to the customer that if there's been a long time since the transmission fluid has been changed, sometimes there'll be varnish on the valves, and the new transmission fluid will wash them off, and some of that varnish will cause valves to stick. And so for that reason, at the Ford place, before we even did a standard transmission service, we would always drive the car to see if there were any problem with the transmission before we serviced it. Because sometimes they would have a transmission problem, and they would bring it in for a service, and they would try to hang it on you whenever, they say, hey, I'm having trouble I wasn't having before. So we were always required to drive the car, make sure it didn't have any transmission problems that they failed to report before we did a service. Same way with the tune-up. You know, if they just say, I want a tune-up, they'll come back if they had a pre-existing problem and claim that you caused it with your tune-up. This one here, that P061B code, the reason that code is there is because of this mass airflow circuit code. And these codes are actually related to that code too. And so here you've got this internal control torque calculation form, because it depends on this to do that. This is an old OTC Nemesis scan tool that I had. I actually bought 2 or 3 of these for the college, and I bought one for myself for $550 when you could still get it at Tooltopia. You know, these tools you can't get anymore. But what I liked about it was it would still talk to OBD1 in addition to talking to OBD2 stuff, and that was something that and you could, you know, it was updatable. You know, it was too at the time. I had one of these that I didn't use very much and carried it in my pickup truck. And my buddy Donnie was telling me at his shop, he says he was having a terrible time finding anything that would talk to OBD1. And he needed something new. And that tool, I hadn't used it hardly at all. And it was practically a brand new tool, even though it was, you know, several years old. And I sold it to him for $150 so he could use it to talk to OBD1. Now, it's not a two-way talker. You're not going to be able to talk both ways with this one, like you can on the higher end scan tools. But this was a really functional scan tool that would graph and everything. Anyway, that's basically what I was touching on right there. But that's a good little scan tool. I've showed screenshots from these tools before, but I never talked about the tool. Here we have fuel pressure being tested with this device here, this digital transducer. its true fuel pressure, and here we've got it on the scan tool. Now you see there's about 10 pounds difference when the vacuum line is plugged into the rail pressure sensor. I got it in reverse. Watch what it does when I brake torque it. Okay, where our fuel pressure is going way down. It's truthfully reporting from the fuel rail pressure sensor, and here I am I'm having to recover, see, because I'm having to push the air out of the fuel rail. All right, we're going to start with a fuel filter. We've probably got a bad fuel pump on this car. Problem here, and what we got, we pull a vacuum. With a vacuum hose hooked up to the fuel pressure regulator, we got 35 pounds, right? All right, so in order to smoke out this problem, we're going to pull the vacuum line off the fuel pressure regulator. Now we got 45 pounds, and when we snap accelerate, yeah, the fuel pressure goes away. That was the first little clip you saw was I was checking. It seems to me like it was a Crown Victoria, and that little yellow Wacom digital fuel pressure tester I had was really, really handy because it had a little transducer you screw into the fuel rail. It had a long wire that would come there. This thing was heavy as a brick in your hand, but it takes little button batteries. You got to have some of those little hands because it'll chew those batteries up and spit them out. But the thing works really, really smooth. And I was comparing it to what the scan tool was reading from the fuel rail pressure sensor, you know, to make sure they both agreed with one another. And I don't even remember what we had to do to fix that Crown Victoria for that fuel pressure problem. And I think it was a really badly clogged fuel filter. The second one this was something I used to do on the motorhomes. Motorhomes would come in there to the Ford place. We despised working on motorhomes, the mechanics did. The service manager even got where he'd pay us $3 an hour extra to work on motorhomes because nobody wanted to work on them. In Panama City, Florida, where there were a lot of motorhomes, the Ford dealer down there wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole because they would be so swamped with motorhomes down there they couldn't even do their regular work. But they'd say, well, we're losing power. We filled it up with gas, but we're still losing power. And I'd get under there and you know, I would pull the engine cover off. I'd pull the fuel pressure regulator hose off, and I would, with the fuel pressure gauge on there, I'd snap the throttle. Now with the fuel pressure regulator hose pulled off, it's going to jump up about 10 pounds. When you snap the throttle, it should hold that fuel pressure. It should not drop. And one after another of those motorhomes would have bad fuel pumps in them. Well, they had 80 gallons of gas in the doggone thing, and we didn't have anything at the dealership that would hold 80 gallons of gas. Even if we decided to pump it all out of there, you imagine how much time consuming that would be. And so I had to devise a way with long pieces of all thread, and you know, on the ends of the tank where there were them straps, and I had these sockets that I designed with 2 air ratchets and all that, and I'd put a piece of all thread in there with the nuts and washers, you know, holding that tank up on each end, because it had a little strap on each end of a little angle iron with a hole drilled in it and mounted it up, but it had straps under the tank too. So I'd take the filler neck loose from the tank, and then I would very slowly, with using greased threads and deep sockets I created for this and 2 air ratchets, I would lower that gas tank with that all thread very slowly with that 80 gallons of gas in it. And I would get it down to the point to where I could take the fuel pump out and put it back in and hook everything back up. And then I could use those 2 air ratchets to raise that 80 gallons gas tank back up. That's a lot of weight there. And I never had a problem doing it that way. It was pretty handy, and it was paid really well too to pull the gas tank off of I mean, the labor hours you can do that. But I mean, I don't know how many times I had to do that. But that was the little fuel power loss problem that I showed you on that little Ranger, I think it was, with that gauge. We pull the fuel pressure regulator hose, snap the throttle. If it loses pressure, instantly, you know, you can go fuel filter first, but typically it's going to be a weak fuel pump. And that's something I came up with. I don't know anybody else that does it that way, but I did it that way, and I taught my students to do it that way. Now, a logic probe has got advantages and disadvantages. You can find power or ground. The light will turn green. The light will turn green if you got ground, and turn red if you got, you know, power. And it's really got a really sharp little point if you need to go into the wire or whatever. It also is really handy for going into those little tiny connectors like that and just touching them. You don't have to shove it in there and screw up the connector and spread the terminal, but you can just touch those things and you can see what's there. The problem was it doesn't tell you if there's any current there, and it takes almost nothing to burn an LED. And I've got a logic probe out there in the toolbox, a Mac Tools one that looks different from this. But that was pretty handy. Working on power windows is really good because you can basically really quickly and check and make sure you got power and ground coming as you rock your switch back and forth. Now a power probe, and I got one of these too. These doggone things have gone up. They're real expensive now. They didn't used to be as expensive as they are now. I saw one of these at Harbor Freight the other day, this same brand, and at Harbor Freight they're like $110 or something, as I remember. But this one's got a little rocker switch, and you can put power or ground in there depending on which way you rock the switch while you read this and while you feed something in there. And I was thinking, well, and this right, it's got a little circuit breaker on it, and it's got a little speaker. It's pretty doggone handy, but you have to know how to use it. And if you put this in the hands of a newbie that doesn't know what they're doing, and they start rocking that switch when they're not supposed to, they can burn something up. So you got to be really, really careful. I had one at the college. Well, I had 2 or 3 of them at the college, and one of them they burned up the tool. Seemed to me like the circuit breaker should have protected it, but it didn't. And but this is a handy little tool to have. And another thing that's good about this is it's got a very long cord. You hook it to the battery, positive and negative. That's the same way this one is. And then you can go anywhere on that car because that cord is really, really long. And it's got an extension cord if you need to go farther than that, you know, like if you're working on something that's big and long too. But anyway, that's a that's a handy thing to know how to use. But like I say, I like using the low impedance test light. It's what I like reading. You know, it'll pull about 1/4 of an amp, because I've learned more with that than I could just measuring with a meter. See, this just sort of doubles as a voltmeter right here. Anyway, for what it's worth. This is a real common failure I've talked about before on 2000s vintage GM products. You know, my buddy Alan came in there with his not working on his 2007, and when we took the fuel tank sender off, there was another one of these over here that was supposed to be there, and it was gone. And you could tell that one it was had just about worn out the strata on that thing. But you can actually buy this part from the GM dealer for like at the time when I was buying them, it was like $140. It's a pretty good idea to go ahead and replace the pump once you're in there, you know. But if you don't want to replace the pump, if you just want to replace the sender, you can buy the sender, and that's what we did there. Now this right here is important, something I had to teach. A lot of the times kids feel like faster is better. You know, you see somebody that's using a drill to drill out a bolt. If you spin that drill too fast, you're going to soften the bit and harden the bolt, and you're going to get where you ain't doing nothing. And so it's a good idea to apply the right kind of pressure with a good sharp brand new bit. And an electric drill, if it's battery powered, an air drill is not really good for this, because an air drill is hard to regulate the speed of it, and if it's turning slower, it's not turning with as much power. An electric drill will do better than this. I mean, better for this. Particularly, usually a corded electric drill is the best, because it produces a pretty good bit of power, even though you're feathering it slowly. But you know, the really good battery drills, like I've got couple of those, they work good for that too. Anyway, so you can take this thing and drill on through there if you can, you know, and keep it lubricated with something while you're doing it. You know, they used to make some really sweet smelling stuff called Tap Magic that was really good for but brake parts cleaner or just about anything that will keep that bit cool and keep it cutting is good. Alright, then whenever you get this, you follow through and you put a helicoil in there. This is exactly the same part as that. We pull the manifold off, put it in a vise, helicoil that, and we put a new stud in there, and that was pretty handy. The other stud had popped off, you know, we had to get it out of there and all that. But that's just basically mechanic in 101. My wife was telling me that she knew this guy that used to get hired by the people at one of the dealerships to come and drill out bolts they had broke off, and that is a foreign thing to me. I've never had anybody offer to drill out a bolt for me. When I broke one off, I had to fix it my own self, and that's the way I've always known it to be at every place I've ever worked. You break it, you fix it. Now, Squirrel did this to my truck twice. I talked about this one time. This was after the first time I fixed it. They got in there and they'd done it again. Now, the truck didn't fail to start this time because it still had some wires connected. But I looked under there after I, about 3 or 4 months after I fixed it, and they had just about chewed them in two again. First time I went out there, it wouldn't even spin the starter. And I got to looking and measuring voltages and saw voltages all over the place, and I found out this was over in front of the, you got to look back in there close to the bulkhead on the passenger sides where this was. And this was my little tool at work right here, where this one here, you got one of them silly spring clamps and soldered those little alligator clips on there, and that holds the wire. And of course the heat shrinks down there out of sight, down inside this convolute tubing. And I put a bunch of rat poison in that convolute tubing when I fixed it this time, and I also put a pack of rat poison down in there, just laying down in this area. But the Honda makes some tape that's got pepper in it that you can buy for like a $50 to $100 a roll, and it's for keeping rats and stuff from chewing on your wires. And you look that up on, I think you can buy it on Amazon. It's tape that's impregnated with hot pepper sauce. You can also get some oil and hot pepper sauce and spray it down in there if you're having issues with this. I haven't had any problems with this lately, but 2 times I had to go in there and fix those wires, and I just love this little thing right here. I talked about that on my last video, but that was when I was using it. Get your wires all ready. You can do a good solder joint there because you got the wires all fed in there. One guy was saying, why don't you just twist the wires together and solder them? Well, that makes a big ugly fix. I like for that thing to look like it's just one piece of wire all the way through after you put the heat shrink on it myself, First car I drove legally was a '63 Corvair. I took this picture of a Corvair engine at a car show we had at our church. This is the PCV valve, and Corvair was the first vehicle, the production vehicle in the United States that had a PCV valve on it. And it was to keep the blow-by from the crankcase from getting out into the air, which was really nasty, particularly in the big cities, and caused a lot of smog. But pretty cool. It's got 2 synchronized carburetors on it. My dad used to work on these things. Look how they got that generator mounted. You see, that's an old generator there, and it's pretty doggone ingenious. You could stuff one of these engines in a Volkswagen Bug if you cut part of the backs of the Bug off and make you and some people did that, but the only problem is the Corvair engine turns backwards. So if you're going to put it in a Volkswagen Bug, you're going to have to put the ring gear on the other side of the pinion, which is easy to do in a Volkswagen transaxle. As a matter of fact, if you're not paying attention and you build a Volkswagen transaxle with the ring gear on the wrong side of the pinion, you're going to have 4 reverse gears. But a Corvair engine turns the opposite direction from just about any other engine, which was interesting too. These were the vehicles I drove. I drove a '55 Chevy pickup. When I was about 14, I was running up and down the road on that truck. I'd park it back where Dad had it because he didn't use it during the day, or he drove something else to his shop. And when I was about 15 years old, I told him, I says, I need you to give me something to drive. And he says, you've been driving my pickup up and down the road for 6 months. I didn't even know he knew I was driving his pickup up and down the road because I thought I was smarter than he was, but I was wrong. I built this buggy at his shop at about the same time I was driving a pickup up and down the road. Me and my brother was on it right there. I drove that thing all over the place. There's a video on my YouTube channel called My Buggy and Theirs, where I had built, I got video of me driving this one, and then I built another one for my boys 23 years later. My dad still had his shop. We built them a buggy, and I taught them how to drive a stick and all that. This was the first car that I drove. My dad had like $150 invested in this car, and it was the first car I drove legally was this blue Corvair Spider. And I could tell you some stories about that one, but I don't have time right now. This right here was the '65 Galaxy with the stacked headlights, and by the time I was a senior in high school, I had paid $950 for the '69 LTD. Had trouble keeping dents out of that one. My dad said was running his shop in the 1960s. He made the remark that whenever he worked on a Corvair, he had to do it with the shop doors closed, even in the summer, because somebody said, why? He said, if somebody sees you working on a Corvair, they'll bring you another one. And that was my dad right there, and that's that old '55 Chevy pickup that I had been driving around on. These right here are these, you know, 97 up through the early 2000s F-150s and stuff, had these junction boxes on them. And it just so happened that sometimes the windshield would leak just enough to get water in this junction box. And when that water got in that junction box, you would have electrical problems of any kind and every kind that you could possibly imagine. They would just scare the daylights out of you. And I don't know how many times I had to, if I had one that came in with wonky, crazy, funky electrical problems, I'd pull this junction box off. It ain't that hard to do. And you pry that thing open back there, and you're going to see all these laminate with all this green corrosion in it because it's been wet. And I would get some of this plastic laminate like you'd use to laminate a document. You know, I had a laminating machine out there in my service bay, and I would actually create a raincoat for this thing that I would put over it to keep water from, and it wasn't enough of a water leak coming in the windshield to do anything other than drip on this. And it wasn't on every vehicle, but a lot of the time there'd be just enough of a water leak where it would drip right on that junction box and ruin it. And you have to have exactly the right one for that vehicle. You know, look it up in the parts room. You know, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's got to be the right one. Kind of like the gym module is even more stringent on having exactly the right one. If you pop another gym module on it, that's not a plug-and-play item. When you see a tensioner that moves that easy, then you have got issues. It's going to make it rattle. One of my students told me that his grandfather told him that the only car anybody ever ought to drive their whole life was a Honda. And he had this Honda, and it was a SUV, and he was having a rattling noise coming from in the front of the engine. So we pulled the timing cover off, and we found this is supposed to be a real, you can't grab this and rattle it like that. This tensioner was wore, the timing belt tensioner wore slam out. Whenever you get a new one, it's got a pin through this hole and that hole right there with that push back. So when you put it all together, you pull that pin out and it eases out, you know, and it holds that tensioner, and it's like a dampened piston is what it basically amounts to. But that was the problem with it rattling. Now the timing belt didn't jump or anything like that, but we replaced the timing belt and we put that on there in order to do that, to fix that, and that was a pretty informative job for him to do on all that and quietened it right up. After this, he went to driving Chevrolets though, for some reason or another, whatever. This was an interesting little situation here. This 94 Escort that we had, it was a junky old car. It had a manual transmission. I taught the young students that didn't know how to drive a stick, how to drive this one, and how to pull up on the drive on lift, you know, on the little old car. And I would have, so every now and then I'd have somebody to do an in-frame overhaul on this thing. Just pull the head, pull the pan, to get the rods and pistons out of there, and we're going to put some rings and bearings in it, you know, and didn't cost all that much to get rings and bearings and gaskets for this thing. It was a good training exercise or an engine repair class for a student that wanted to go that distance, you know, and rebuild an engine. And Bobby came to me and he says, "Look at this pitted cylinder wall in here. Don't we need to do something about it?" It was rust pitted. And apparently this thing, the piston had stopped right there, and coolant had, or something, or condensation got there. Anyway, it ate that cylinder wall out. And I said, this is not a vehicle that anybody's going to be driving on the road. We're just going to drive it around on the, you know, college parking lot and all this stuff, and in the field out there by the pond, by the college pond. I said, so let's just go ahead and slam a set of rings in there and not worry about it. Well, he went ahead and, you know, honed this out like you would if you were going to put rings in anything else, you know, with the cylinder hone. And he said, we put it back together, and this thing ran, and it didn't use a lot of oil as far as I could tell, didn't smoke or anything, didn't skip on that cylinder, and it just really surprised me that it did as well as it did, putting it back together with that, you know, you could rub your finger across that, and it was a deep, pitted, rusty thing and all that. And I took that picture of it for that purpose, you know. Now, on Chrysler Transmission's clutch volume index is a diagnostic measure. It assesses the amount of fluid pressure required to apply a clutch before it can achieve the gear ratio. Generally, CVI values below 70 are considered good, and above 75 indicate significant wear. If you get used to looking at these on a lot of different Chryslers, you'll get to where you can pick one out that's a problem. if the number is really higher than what you're used to seeing, see, these all look pretty good based on this standard right here. That one's pretty high overdrive clutch volume index, and that means you got fluid leakage in that circuit, or you got a clutch that's trying to slip there and it's having to give it more fluid pressure to get it to apply properly. And so that was an interesting little snap scan tool screenshot I got from an Autel scan tool. Now this thing right here, I worked at several shops where I would see this doggone thing laying around, and I look, I says, doggone it, look at this, what in the Sam Hill is that thing? And me, 2 or 3 of my buddies would see these at various different shops they worked at and had no idea what they were. Well, I found this in a shop manual, and if you look, you can't read that very well, but J21552 is the part number they show right here. Now this doesn't look exactly like that, but that's the tool they're talking about. And I used to have my students take these steering boxes apart and put them back together, and it's a ball nut in there, and these balls have to roll through a little tube that's split in half there, and I'd have them put all that stuff together. What I didn't realize when I had them doing this, until I saw this later, was this is made to stick in there and keep those balls in place in that ball nut, and then before you put it back together. It's also used for steering rack repairs, this same tool. So if you ever seen one of those, that J21552, that's what it's for. It's totally for, steering rack and steering box repairs is what that tool is for. Now this right here was a tool that we had to buy. Well, this girl I had doing some work on a 5.4 3-valve, and this little tool right here actually depresses the valve spring enough so that you can get the roller rocker out. You can see the roller rocker right there, and this helps you take out all of those roller rockers, and you need to do that on this one. Now on the Explorers, you can pop those roller rockers out of there without doing anything like this, like on the 4-liter Explorer, the single overhead cam, like the ones in my white one. It's a good idea to pop them roller rockers out of there, because without the roller rockers in there, you can turn the camshaft any way you want to turn it. There's not any pressure trying to get it to move when you're putting the timing chains on, all that kind of stuff. And that's just the handiest way to do it. You're also not going to bend valves and that kind of stuff when you're moving things around. So it's pop all them roller rockers out using that tool, and then you're in good shape. That thing is not that hard to use, although it's a little tricky the first couple of times you use it. Make sure you lubricate the threads and all that with some grease and make it work better for you and all that. It's pretty handy. Now this Snap-on AT1 is a mica undercutter for reconditioning starter and generator armatures. We did that job with a hacksaw blade when I worked at the gas station in the mid-70s. But I didn't even know there was such a thing, but I do know that I was taught to take a hacksaw blade and undercut those, and that you scratch it a little bit and all, but it don't really matter. But we were basically trying to undercut the mica so that it wouldn't be, I don't even know why that's a big deal. Most of the time you don't even pay attention to that nowadays, and even if you're going to put brushes in the starter. Now this one here was obviously beyond repair. This was one that we pulled the starter off of over there. It was one of the Chevrolet. And look at that commutator, how messed up, burned out all that stuff is. That was beyond repair. We just had to put a starter on that one. Believe it or not, that starter was still starting the truck, but it didn't sound right. Well, it's crazy what that'll do. This was Adam. He was my adjunct instructor for the last few years I taught. He was in my office posting some grades or something there. You can see all my certificates and stuff on the wall that I brought there from the Ford place, and my clock that looks like a brake rotor that I bought. It was pretty cool. And then I got pictures of family up here on the wall and all that. But that was looking into my office at the college, and all that stuff. There's my printer over there and my PC, and that girl in the front office says, "Hey, do you want this computer desk that I don't know what to do with?" I said, "Sure," and I took it down there. I was the only one that had one of these. Adam was also my first graduate. He finished the program back in 2001, and he was very, very, very sharp. Everything he did a really good job of it, and I had a lot of respect for Adam and still do. Well, that winds us up. We've been here about 30 minutes. I hope you guys were able to stay with me the whole time. Incidentally, there's the box that tool came in. I showed you earlier, that 3-valve spring compressor. And so hope you have a good week, and I hope you come back and see me next time. Give me some comments on this, share the video, whatever you feel like you need to do. But in 10 seconds we will have been here 30 minutes, and I'm going to log out before we get there. See you next week.